The spring breakup on the Athabasca River does not arrive gently. Above. It tears through the Alberta foothills like something that has been imprisoned all winter and has finally run out of patience. And it was into the teeth of that chaos, on a gray Thursday afternoon in April, that Tova Kessler drove her truck off the road and into the ditch, 3 kilometers south of nowhere. She hadn't been going fast. That was the part that would embarrass her later. The road was clear, the sun was actually out for once, and she had both hands on the wheel because her hands were always on the wheel since the accident. She wasn't texting. She wasn't crying, not yet. The front left tire had simply found the one patch of black ice the morning sun hadn't reached, and that was enough. The truck slid sideways with a sound like a sigh, dropped 2 meters into the drainage ditch, and came to rest at a 45-degree angle against a stand of bare poplar. The airbag hit her in the face. She sat there for a moment, tasting blood from her lip, staring at the crumpled hood. Outside the window, the Athabasca Valley was beautiful and completely indifferent to her. She had no cell service. Above. She had known before she left Edmonton that she would have no cell service once she got past Hinton, and she had told herself that was the point. 12 days at her late grandmother's property on the edge of Jasper National Park. 12 days of not being reachable, not being findable, not being the woman whose name everyone in that courtroom had learned to say with a particular combination of pity and suspicion. 12 days to figure out what came next. What came next, apparently, was this. Tova pushed the door open against the slope of the ditch, crawled out onto the wet gravel shoulder, and took stock. The truck wasn't going anywhere. The left front axle was sitting at an angle that required no mechanical expertise to diagnose. The temperature, which had been reasonable at 2 in the afternoon, was already dropping as the sun moved behind the ridge. She had a coat. She had boots. She had a duffel bag in the back that she managed to pull out after some effort, and she had the document envelope she had been carrying in her jacket's inner pocket since she left the city, pressed flat against her ribs like she was afraid someone would take it from her. She had been carrying it that way for 6 weeks. She pulled the duffel onto her shoulder and started walking north on the gravel road. There were no other vehicles. There had been no other vehicles since she turned off the highway 40 minutes ago. The poplars on either side stood bare and watchful, their reflections fractured in the snowmelt, pooling at the road's edge. A raven called once from somewhere up the ridge and did not call again. She had been walking for 20 minutes when she heard the truck. It came from behind her, which meant it had come from the highway, and it slowed when it reached the ditch where her vehicle sat steaming gently in the cold air. She turned. The truck was an older F-350, the kind that had earned its dents honestly, and it pulled to a stop on the shoulder. The man who stepped out was not what she expected, though she wasn't sure what she had expected. He was tall in the way that men from this part of the country sometimes were, not performing it, just built for the scale of the landscape. He looked at her truck, then at her, then at the duffel bag on her shoulder. "You hurt?" he said. "No," Tova said. He looked at her lip. "My airbag," she said. He nodded once. He introduced himself as Cade Hollowell. He said it the way men out here said their names, like a piece of information, not a greeting. He said he ran a property about 4 kilometers up the road and could take her there until she got sorted. He said it plainly, without the elaborate reassurance that would have made her trust him less. She got in the truck. She told herself later that it was practical. It was getting dark. She had no phone signal and nowhere else to go. She told herself that and mostly believed it, except for the part of her that recognized, with a weariness that went all the way to the bone, that she was simply too tired to be afraid of one more thing. The property was a working one. She could see that immediately. A large barn, newer than the house. A woodshed stacked with precision. A dog, some kind of shepherd cross, that watched her get out of the truck from the porch steps without barking. The house itself was old but tight, the kind of building that had been maintained rather than renovated, and it smelled inside of wood smoke and coffee and cut lumber. Cade Hollowell did not ask her questions. He put a pot of coffee on. He found a clean cloth for her lip without being asked. He sat across the kitchen table from her and drank his own coffee and looked out the window at the river valley going dark. It was the not asking that undid her a little. She had been asked so many questions by the police, by the lawyers, by her mother on the phone, by the journalist who had found her email address somehow and had sent her a message with the subject line, just your side of it, She had answered every question carefully, the way her lawyer had told her to, and in the end it hadn't mattered because the questions themselves were the verdict. People didn't ask questions about you unless they already suspected the answer. The road will be worse tomorrow if it freezes tonight, Cade said, still looking at the window. You can stay here, there's a room. I don't want to put you out, Tova said. You're not, he said. She stayed. She woke in the night to the sound of ice moving on the river, a grinding, buckling roar that she felt in the walls before she heard it with her ears, and she lay still in the dark room listening to it until her heart slowed down. The document envelope was on the bedside table. She had taken it out of her jacket before she lay down, without quite being able to put it in the duffel, and it sat there in the dark with the particular weight of things that contain facts that cannot be unknown. In the morning she found Cade already up, standing at the kitchen counter with a mug, and he asked her how she took her coffee, and that was all. Through the window the river was a changed thing, the ice shelves broken and grinding against each other, the brown water moving with a speed that seemed personal. She spent most of the day outside, helping with the kind of work that accumulated over winter on a property like this. It wasn't requested, she just found herself doing it, moving fence posts that had heaved with the frost, stacking wood that had been split but not yet stored. The dog, whose name was apparently Duff, eventually decided she was acceptable and followed her from task to task. That evening Cade cooked. She washed the dishes because it felt wrong not to. He was leaning in the doorway of the kitchen, and she had her back to him when she heard him say, quietly, "You don't have to tell me what you're carrying." She stopped washing. "But I've been around enough people who had something heavy on them," he said, "to know when someone does." She didn't turn around. The envelope was upstairs on the bedside table, and she thought about it with a clarity that was almost physical. "It's legal documents," she said finally. "From a trial." "Your trial?" "I wasn't charged. I was a witness." She set the plate she was holding in the drying rack. "My husband was charged." The kitchen was quiet except for the fire in the river. "Was," Cade said. "He died in custody," Tova said, 4 months ago, before the verdict." She had said it more times than she could count, to the lawyers, to her mother, to the constable from the RCMP who had come to tell her, his hat in his hands. Standing at the door of the apartment she had moved into after everything fell apart, she had said it enough times that it had stopped feeling like a sentence and started feeling like a fact, the way the date of a battle became just a date. But something about saying it here, in this kitchen, with her hands still in the dishwater, made the fact feel like what it actually was, which was something that had happened to a real person. Her hands were shaking. She took them out of the water and dried them on the dish towel. "What were you going to do?" Cade asked. "At your grandmother's place." "I was going to figure out what to do with this," she said. She went upstairs and came back with the envelope. She set it on the kitchen table. She told him he didn't have to look at it, but he had asked, and she was so tired of carrying it alone. He sat down. He opened it. He read it in the way that people who are accustomed to reading difficult documents read them, carefully without expression, turning pages at the pace the material required. She sat across from him and watched his face. When he finished, he set the papers down. He looked at her. "You knew," he said. It was not an accusation. "No," she said. "And then I found this, and then yes." What the envelope contained was not in the end about her husband. That was the part she had never been able to explain to anyone properly, the part that made every conversation a reconstruction project. The documents were about the company her husband had worked for, a land management outfit that contracted with the provincial government, the kind of company whose name appeared on forestry permits and environmental assessments, and that no one looked at too closely because no one looked at those things. What the document showed was that the assessments had been falsified, not in a minor way, in a way that had allowed the company to drain a watershed that fed 3 indigenous communities downstream, and to do so with the full documented knowledge of 2 people in the company whose names appeared on the government's own records. Her husband had not been charged with any of that. He had been charged with fraud, a separate thing, a financial thing, the kind of charge that made him look like a common criminal and made the story simple. The land story never made it to trial. The land story had been, as nearly as Tova could reconstruct it, very deliberately buried. One of the two names on the documents was a man who now sat on the board of a federally regulated resource company. The other name was on a provincial appointment. That was what she had been carrying against her ribs for 6 weeks. "You can't take this to a lawyer," Cade said. "I know. Because the lawyer would tell you to hand it to the Crown. And then it would go away," Tova said. "Like the last time." He looked at her. She watched something shift in his face. Not pity, which was what she had been getting for months. Something else, something that looked more like recognition. "My father was a surveyor," he said. He said it slowly, the way people said things when they were measuring each word. He spent 20 years doing boundary work for the government, treaty land, mostly. He found something once, a set of records that showed a boundary had been deliberately moved. He paused. He handed it to the right people. "What happened?" "Nothing," Cade said. "He retired early. We moved here." The fire snapped. Outside, the river went on doing what rivers did. "My mother grew up in the community downstream," Cade said. "The one that's been dealing with the water." Tova looked at him. "She's been sick," he said. "A lot of people have been sick. They've been told it's unrelated to the watershed." He said unrelated the way you said a word you had been told to accept and had never managed to. The thing that had been pressed flat against her ribs for 6 weeks, the thing that had been making it difficult to breathe properly since she had found it, expanded in her chest into something different, something that was still frightening, but was no longer quite the same shape. "I was going to find a journalist," she said, "but I don't know which ones to trust. I don't know which ones have already been given the simple version of this story and written it." "I know someone," Cade said. She looked at him steadily. "A woman in Vancouver," he said. "She's been working the water file for 3 years. She's been looking for the paper trail and not finding it because it was buried at the company level." He paused. "These are the papers she can't find." Tova looked down at the documents on the kitchen table. She thought about the morning she had found them. In a storage unit her husband had rented under a name she hadn't known about, a fact that had initially looked like evidence of his guilt and had turned out to be evidence of his terror. He had known what was in those documents. He had known what would happen to someone who held them. He had put them somewhere that he thought couldn't be connected to her. He had also, in the end, been right that he would not survive. She had carried them against her chest, initially, because she was afraid. She saw now, in the clear and particular light of this kitchen on the edge of a flooded river valley in April, that somewhere along the way the reason had changed. She wasn't carrying them out of fear anymore. "If she runs this story," Tova said, "my name is in it. Probably. People will say I sat on it. People will say I chose when to release it." "Yes," Cade said. "They will say that." She looked at him. He didn't look away. "My mother's name will also be in it," he said quietly. "Probably. If the community downstream is part of the story, and they should be, her name will be in it." He paused. "I've already talked to her. She said to find the person who has the documents." The logs settled in the stove. The river moved outside in the dark. "How did you know I had them?" Tova said. Cade looked at her for a long moment. "I didn't," he said. "I just knew you were carrying something." In the morning, she called the journalist from Cade's landline. The woman's name was Augustine Marsh, and she answered on the second ring. And when Tova said she had documents related to the watershed assessments on the North Athabasca tributary, there was a silence on the line so complete that Tova could hear the journalist's breathing stop and start again. "Where are you?" Augustine said. Tova told her. "I can be there in 2 days," Augustine said. "Don't scan them, don't photograph them. Don't let them out of your hands." "I haven't," Tova said. "For 6 weeks. Another silence. "I know what this cost you," Augustine said. Her voice had changed register. "I know whose name is attached to this file." "He wasn't who they said he was," Tova said. "He was scared. He made a terrible choice to protect himself and it destroyed us. But he wasn't who they said." "I know," Augustine said. "I've been trying to say that for 2 years." I just didn't have the peace that explained why. After she hung up, Tova stood in the kitchen for a moment, the landline receiver still warm in her hand. Through the window, Cade was in the yard with Duff, both of them watching the river in the way that people watched rivers during breakup, with a respect that was close to reverence, because you understood that the water was stronger than any decision you might make about it, and the best you could do was understand where it was going. She put the receiver down and went outside. The air smelled of wet spruce and cold mud, and the particular mineral sharpness of glacial water. She stood on the porch steps, and Duff looked at her, and Cade looked at the river, and she thought about her grandmother, who had lived alone on a piece of land for 40 years after her own husband died, and who had said once, in the way that her grandmother said, that the only difference between carrying something and putting it down was deciding you had carried it far enough. She didn't know what came next. The story would get out, and it would be complicated, and people would say things about her that were wrong, and she would have to live inside that for a while. The two men whose names were on those documents had lawyers whose entire function was to manage exactly this kind of moment. She was 27 years old, and her husband was dead, and she had been living for 6 weeks, like someone waiting for permission to breathe. She stepped off the porch and walked across the wet grass to stand beside Cade. He didn't say anything, neither did she. The ice was still moving on the Athabasca, groaning and grinding, all that accumulated winter breaking apart in the current and moving at last, irreversibly, toward where it was going. She reached into her jacket and found that her hand went automatically to the place where the envelope had been pressed against her ribs for 6 weeks. The pocket was flat. The documents were on the kitchen table, where she had left them. She left her hand there anyway for a moment over her own heartbeat, feeling the unfamiliar lightness of a body that had put something down.